right, well, thank you all for coming. We learned a lot this morning. We're going to kind of move towards looking at are there solutions or directions to go. But first, I want to go back into a bit of history on what we're facing is nothing new. I mean, China, you look at China and technology, China's been playing technology catch-up very seriously for a long time. I mean, it was the 1860s after the Opium War time when they saw the modern weapons that the foreigners had that they started the self-strengthening movement, and Li Hongzhan and others were building modern factories down in Guangdong. Then you come to Mao taking over. One of the first things he did was put together a technology group under the guidance of the Russians. Remember, there was 11,000 Russian technicians that came to China, and 40,000 Chinese went to get educated in Russia in the 1950s. And a lot of that was about industrializing China, which was the technology of the day. In 1956, Mao puts out a policy with, I think it was 852 different programs on technology. And what that plan ended up with was 2 bombs and a satellite. The hydrogen bomb, the atom bomb, and then the 1970 East is Red satellite. Deng Xiaoping comes into office, same thing. And he puts together, he makes a 4th modernization, and he puts together a group to come up with technology plans, and they came up with a very wide-reaching plan. But from that day on, technology became part of the responsibility of the premier. It goes right into the premier's office in China. It doesn't go into the White House in the United States, and it goes less into the White House than it used to before some of these offices were disbanded. Who and when come into office, their slogan is scientific development, and they put together indigenous innovation. Indigenous innovation, unfortunately, the Chinese planners are often too wordy in what they put out because they want to tell their people above them what a great job they've done and how aggressive they're being. And indigenous innovation called for re-innovating, co-innovating, master the technologies of your foreign partners, and then go beat them overseas. And that woke up the technology community quite strongly. There was a lot of pushback. And so then we move on to strategic emerging industries in about 2009 to 2011, where, okay, let's now go for the industries and the technologies of the future, things that are still viable, still not developed and owned by everybody. And they put tons of money into that, into state entities, into state facilities, and ended up wasting a lot of money. And actually the science community in China was getting very tainted with how do we get our hands on the money, not what do we accomplish. So now we have Xi Jinping with Made in China 2025, which is from a Chinese point of view, it's a much smarter model because it has to do with why steal technology when you can buy technology, when you can buy companies. Let's use our entrepreneurs. Let's use venture capital. The unfortunate part of it is, once again, it's about a big overreach. My father had a saying, anything worth doing is worth overdoing, and that could be the slogan of the Communist Party planners, because Made in China 2025 is about domination. It's about crushing. It's about eliminating foreign companies in the China market and then beating them globally with quotas in various industries. So no matter how benign you may look at it, it's just, I think when it comes down to the real core issue we're talking about here, it's about the interface. The interface between a Chinese system that is now rich and powerful and very capable with a completely different way, a very different way of doing things than the established way the Western business world and regulatory world works, and how do you make that interface work? So with those few remarks opening, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming to our fireside chat without the fire. Just a question back to you, just before we get into the sort of what's next and the solutions and so forth. Made in China 2025, just as for scene setting, is there something that you think is fundamentally different about Made in China 2025 as compared to what came before or is it, you said it's better, sort of more efficient, maybe executed better. But is there something fundamentally different? And if not, is the real fundamental change that's occurred over the last several years between the US and China really concerned just about China's size, that it's gotten to the point that we really need to take it seriously? Or is the policy fundamentally different from what it was before?
I think it's both of those things. I mean, China is now so capable and powerful. And it's, I mean, American technology companies, the leading companies, Xi Jinping is more important to them than Donald Trump, because the Chinese market is often where they're having the majority of their sales, and it's where their fastest growing and largest market is. On the other hand, the thing about it is really an all hands on deck, all of government approach on Made in China 2025. It's just not one of many plans, and it's Xi Jinping, and it's written into the party constitution. And really, there's been a fundamental change under Xi Jinping. He's a different character, right? He's turned it back to top-down Leninism, and he's got, he's got a grip on everything, or wants to have a grip on everything, and then that influences, I think, this, and also the fear factor.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic, right? Particularly in light of some of the statistics we saw earlier about other non-U.S. companies and their R&D expenditures and so forth. And we don't seem to care that much that Samsung is the largest R&D spender in the world, or that Siemens is on the list, or Bosch is on the list. There really does seem something fundamentally different about China, which I think goes to a core issue. Are we concerned about the economic competition only, or is there something really different about China? And I think it really does come back to there is a sense of fundamental unfairness about what China is doing. And I'm not taking a position on that one way or another. But why does the U.S., what bothers us so much about China? It really is the degree of state intervention, I think, as opposed to merely the economic competition that's bothering the Trump administration in particular. When I in terms of the next steps and where we think this may end up, about 2 years ago, I asked a high-level trade official in the then new Trump administration, what is it that we really want to accomplish with respect to China? And this is just when they were first starting to make noises about 301. And they said to change China's behavior, to which my response was, okay, and what? And what is it exactly that you want to accomplish? At the time, they didn't really have a concrete answer other than sort of fundamental reform throughout the entire system, which would include Made in China 2025 and all that goes along with it. I think they've gotten a little bit more precise, I think, in their discussions with China, but it's still not entirely clear, I think, to the outside world, at least, what exactly it is that we're asking for, which makes it difficult to give any sort of prognostication about where this is ultimately going to end up. I mean, I think we've probably got really three options. Whenever anybody says three options, it always means the first two are going to be on either extreme and the third one's going to be in the middle. And it will, by definition, sound reasonable because it's the one in the middle, whether it's reasonable or not. So the two extremes are, we cut an easy deal on, I think what Wendy Cutler referred to as the shopping list. They agree to buy soybeans and LNG, and then we all go away. I think there are some in the administration who would be happy with that. I don't think they're the folks who have the persuasive voice at the moment. I don't think that's a likely outcome. I think that will be part of the outcome. I don't think it's going to be the final outcome. The other extreme is a complete decoupling, or an attempted decoupling of the economies, which is impossible. But I think there are some of the administration who do want to go in that direction, but I don't think it's a realistic possibility. What I think where we're likely going to end up, in my view at least, is somewhere in the middle, which is more or less a slow burn between the economies. I don't think come beginning of March, we're going to get a deal, a one-off deal, which says, okay, now we're done. We've cut the deal, and we're out of here. We may get something that the president will no doubt claim to be a great success, and it may be, but I don't think we can expect an end to this tension anytime in the near future. And I don't think we should be distracted by the tariff discussion. Whenever we get into this discussion about the trade war, it always goes to tariffs. And are we or are we not going to keep our $250 billion of tariffs? Or are they going to go up? Are we going to hit the rest of them? And so on. And the tariffs are important, and they are important to lots of folks in the U.S. economy. But I don't think we should be distracted by it and think that really is the essence of the trade war. I don't think that is the essence of the trade war. I think what you've really got is all the other stuff we've been talking about today, which is this fundamental concern about technology transfer, legitimate or illegitimate, state-directed or not state-directed. Who is going to control the emerging and foundational technologies for the foreseeable future? He who controls the technologies controls the world, controls the economy, therefore controls the world. That's really where the debate is going to be. And so even if the tariffs go away, I think we're going to continue to have a slow burn on things like CFIUS and export controls and visa policy. I think we're going to continue to see the U.S. try to remove Chinese suppliers from the supply chain here in the United States and abroad. And I think the U.S. is going to try to proselytize about this to third countries, which they've already started to do. Perhaps the point of the spear on that may be the shutting out of certain Chinese companies from the telecommunications market among U.S. allies. But I think they're going to continue to try to push those kinds of policies globally in an attempt to sort of triangulate, if you will, and outflank China. Unclear whether that's going to succeed. Unclear whether that kind of aggressive policy is ultimately going to be in the U.S. long-term interest. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't. But you can certainly see a situation where all of this just results in a flight of R&D outside the United States because the environment is so hostile. It may cut off significant funding for Silicon Valley startups and such. And it may, over the long term, and I do wonder about your views on this as well, whether what we're going to see is convergence is too strong a word, but whether we're going to see a return to some of the policies where the U.S. feels like the only way to fight is to have significant more U.S. government intervention, and whether we're seeing that in the economy in promoting technology, things like the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, used to be DIU-X, experimental, they dropped the X. Are we going to see that? Are we going to see a return to additional funding for science and technology in the U.S. To compete with China? And if not, where does that leave us?
Well, I sit in China, and I'm just so blown away by what I've seen China accomplish and what I've seen my friends, Chinese entrepreneurs, accomplish, and the companies there that are so powerful, and so much of it happened through just hunger and hard work. I think the party has really hurt their own entrepreneurs now because China is completely capable of building an incredible tech sector. The Chinese entrepreneurs, whether they're trained at Stanford or Beida, or whether they worked for Hewlett-Packard or Huawei, the capabilities of the country are incredible. The market is incredible. The venture capital is flowing. There's too much of it. It's readily available. And so if the party would trust its own people to build the tech sector, and you had these entrepreneurs out buying companies, nobody would really care. Because, okay, if you're buying a company and you're going to compete with everybody else, it's fine. The problem is, and this is the core really of the industrial policy, is that under China Inc., if China buys a foreign company, that company comes to China, it's a Chinese company, it's already there. And so then the regulatory mechanisms and there's all the funding you would want, they can then kill the other foreign companies in that market in China for robotics or whatever, and then they are going to win globally, because if you're not making it in China, you're not going to make it globally. So that's why this is an existential threat, or looked at as an existential threat by many businesses. What happens with Syngenta now with all of the seed varieties they have? China's are all of a sudden starting to accept some GMO. Why? Because they've got their own company now that does it. And it's all really so unnecessary, because Chinese business and American business gets along very well. Our kids get along, they go to school together, but it's this fundamental difference between the systems. Now I want to turn it back to you for a second, because with CFIUS being expanded through this FIRMA Act, and quite a lot of support for it. What was 85 to 10 in the Senate and 400 to 2 in the House, something like that, the vote to expand CFIUS for a much wider array of reviewing Chinese investments. Now, there's some people that are very worried about that, and I'm sure a lot of them sit in the Silicon Valley in the venture capital industry who are worried, because there's just such tight cross-border flow right now. I'm a supporter of it, actually, because you can't make China change. You're not going to. Jonathan Spence went through that a long time ago. You can't change China. But what you can do is you can make their unacceptable behaviors not successful. If China starts getting blocked from buying companies here where there is state money, PLA money, you don't know the ownership, but then entrepreneurs can do it, that's a start. Well, then you can go to, I'll answer my own question, then you can go to, well, can you trust the entrepreneurs because the Chinese government has a grip on everybody? So with that complicated question, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the last point, I think, is the key point. I mean, if you ask people who sit on the CFIUS committee, do you see a meaningful distinction between a private Chinese company and a state-owned Chinese company, they will tell you no, that they don't. So I don't know from a regulatory perspective if we had an influx of nominally private Chinese investment, whether that would make a significant difference in the policy, because they believe everything is state-directed at the end of the day. In terms of enforcement, whether this is the way forward, it may be the only way forward, right? I mean, there are only so many levers that the U.S. has. Let's sort of posit for the moment that this is a legitimate concern that the U.S. has, and I know there are different views in the room on that. But let's just posit for a moment that it's a legitimate concern. If it's a legitimate concern, there are only so many levers the U.S. has, short of war. None of us want to be there. So the WTO mechanism has its shortcomings. It doesn't address, and I think the Trump administration is probably right on this, doesn't really address a lot of the significant concerns that they have with Chinese policies. So you're left at the end of the day with self-help. So what does self-help look like? Self-help looks like tariffs. It looks like CFIUS. It looks like export controls. It looks like visa policy. So these are the levers the U.S. government has. There's not a lot more left in the toolbox. And this is not a new issue. I mean, I was at the U.S. Trade Representative's office for 6 years in the Bush II administration, trying to figure out, and it's the same issues, smaller scale, but same issues. So China IP issues, same concern. What are the points of leverage? What are the tools in the toolbox? And frankly, there just aren't that many. And the ones that are there are fairly blunt instruments. So the CFIUS reform was intended to get at all the issues we've been talking about today. Chinese access to U.S. technology, export controls, same thing. I go back to I guess 2 points. One, if the point is to curb Chinese technological advancement, it may do that. It may not, right? I mean, I was talking to some of the other folks in the room about whether we've reached an inflection point in China where you really can't turn it back at this point. They've gotten to the point where they're just going to continue regardless of what we do. Maybe it will slow the process. Maybe it won't. The other point is the point I was making earlier about third countries. Does this work as a truly unilateral approach to China work, whether it be export controls or whether it be CFIUS or any of these others? Or is it just going to drive R&D offshore, meaning outside the United States? Are we going to see significant R&D centers crop up in Vancouver, right? Or more in the UK and more elsewhere in Europe, and so on? The system, the levers that the U.S. has are only going to work if there really is a unified front outside of China. And what's interesting, one of the interesting things about the CFIUS legislation is there's an explicit direction to the administration to go out and proselytize about this and try to get other countries to sign up to similar systems. Again, maybe we're seeing the effects of some of that, results of some of those kinds of discussions with some of the recent events on certain Chinese telecommunications and other companies around the world. Maybe we're seeing it in the EU pursuing its own version of CFIUS. Are we going to see more and more of that? I think that's going to be the U.S. approach, and that's really, as I said, really the only terms of engagement that the U.S. really has going forward, absent the negotiation of new rules. And the negotiation of new rules, I think, is a long way away from that, from reaching that point where we really can say these are the codified terms of engagement we're going to have with China going forward. It just doesn't seem like that's in the offing anytime soon.
I'm going to turn it to questions in the audience. My final thought here is it's about trust. The trust has just disappeared between the countries and the governments. And how do you rebuild that trust? I do not know how to answer that, actually. Go ahead.
So first question. So I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about some unintended consequences of these policies, second order policy consequences, to give some examples. In the Silicon Valley, as you know, probably, the semiconductor sector has long been a bedrock of the tech sector, but in recent years it's been underfunded because it's not popular among VCs. It's a long-term capital-intensive sector, and that's actually been funded a lot by Chinese capital. With CFIUS amendments, that money's going away, both because U.S. policy doesn't want that to happen and because the Chinese investors are afraid to make those commitments. So that's putting a hole in the development of the U.S. semiconductor sector. If the export controls come into place, and it sounds like they will affect exports of sensitive semiconductor chips and other technologies to China, that's going to impact quite a few big tech companies that sell into China. A significant portion of their revenues are Chinese revenues that may or may not be permitted anymore, right? Third example is supply chain. If I were a big tech or any other company that has sensitive technology, I would be not talking about this, but I would be putting a plan B into place because I don't have any confidence there's going to be a real ultimate deal struck. I mean, there's as you say, it's a long burn, right? So I would start to disengage, not fully, but a lot of my supply chain, and there will be all kinds of difficulties associated. That doesn't happen overnight. And finally, if I'm a Chinese company, I'm going to go out and create a global network for myself because I know that I may not be able to export into the U.S. from China anymore. The 25% tariffs are going to concern me a lot. So I'm going to set up in Mexico. I'm going to set up in Thailand. This is going to promote the globalization of Chinese industry all over the world. They're going to become much more global and nimble and spry than they were before. So speculate on second order unintended consequences.
Well, what's happening on supply chains in China, I see, is surprisingly, there are quite a few multinationals digging themselves deeper into China. If you're in the industrial manufacturing sector, you're in electric vehicles, you're in chemicals, you're in coatings, you're in components. They actually are buying Chinese companies now. They're getting more deeply embedded in the market because they see that as, for manufacturing, it's still going to be the place, especially for electric vehicles and some of those things. Others who source from China for manufacturing elsewhere are moving supply chains out. When you talk about Silicon Valley money and drying up, it's true. I mean, we should maybe, I know I'll be looked at as a communist, but why don't we have Made in America 2030? That's what our space program was. We used to do planning and we used to have government initiatives in this country, but then the politicians started saying that markets solve all things and let's cut taxes as much as we can so that markets will handle everything. Well, how's that worked out for us? I mean, we are underperforming and China's driven and focused and moving ahead, and we're just sitting back and twirling around. So it's about time we got our whatever together.
There's a question in the back, and then we have Z up front.
Did you have any?
Hi, it's Mike Zelensiger of Oxford Economics. As Jim McGregor well knows, I've been writing and thinking about Asia for a long time. I'm struck by the fact that 35 years ago, the Chinese were smart enough to say to the Germans and to the Americans, we don't really understand this supply chain stuff. Build it for us. We want 51% ownership, but we want you to help build out a system, and they were very successful at learning from us. It strikes me that there's a contradiction in American policy now. On the one hand, you correctly said, Jim Mendenhall, I think I heard you say, that we need a multilateral approach to deal with China, but at the same time, we're trying to blow up the WTO, trying to blow up most of our alliances in Europe, and it strikes me that this is a fundamental contradiction of U.S. policy today.
The answer is TPP, and here's the man.
Yes, you correctly characterized what I was attempting to say. There is a clear contradiction. It was a huge mistake, in my view, for the Trump administration to pull out of TPP right out of the box. I'm guessing that if you ask some of the administration right now, they're probably rethinking that as a bad idea. There needs to be a multilateral approach to this. On the WTO side, the Trump administration clearly does not see the WTO as the solution. If you look at, and they see China as the problem. They see other problems with the WTO as well, but China really is the problem. And if you read what the U.S. has said in the WTO, Dennis Shea, the U.S. ambassador to the WTO just a few weeks ago, issued a statement or delivered a statement in the WTO saying, because he was responding to concerns that the U.S. was the one blowing up the multilateral trading system. His response was, in a quote, there was a fundamental incompatibility, that's his word, of the Chinese system with basically a fair and transparent open trading system. And then he went after everybody else in the world and he said, it's everybody's fault for not bringing enough attention to this over the last couple of years. There is a contradiction. I think if you ask USTR, or whether they say it or they won't, they would try to reconcile the contradiction by saying, we need a multilateral solution. WTO is not it. We're going to go out bilaterally and try to create our own network, which is basically what TPP was. So there's another contradiction. But create our own network of alliances, trade and otherwise, and try to outflank China. And no, I can't reconcile that with things like the steel and aluminum tariffs on the rest of the world and the proposed car tariffs and that sort of thing.
Well, and we were talking earlier, I mean, TPP basically was to modernize trade language. Trade language in the WTO goes back to GATT. It's before a lot of cross-border investment, before global supply chains, before the internet, et cetera. And so TPP was to put modern language into a trade agreement that then could be morphed into the WTO and elsewhere. And NAFTA, whatever it's called, YMCA or something, I forget. The new NAFTA, it was a lot of TPP language, right?
It was. And we claimed great victory after getting the NAFTA 2.0. So go figure.
We have one question in the back, and then we're going to come to you, Z.
Jim and Jim, would you like to comment a little bit? As you know, Rhodium has done a lot of study that the last couple of years, Chinese invested a lot of research and development center right around this area. And a lot of them, we know who they are. Now, I noticed that recently, like Huawei has been prohibited from exporting their technology, which has gotten patents in the US, and I guess they should own them. I guess the lawyers can tell more about that. And I heard the same thing is happening, and I even hear from my former employee, IBM, that they're talking about a lot of the issues with all the research lab. Would you like to comment in terms of how or what kind of prediction, by looking at a crystal ball, in terms of Silicon Valley, how we should look at that issue?
That's complicated. I'm for reciprocity, and not strict reciprocity, because each country has a different strength and the different sectors have different strengths, but to change the conversation. U.S. and China go back to each other and say, look, it's a new day and age. You want a great power relationship, a new era, great power relationship, how she puts it. Okay, here's what it is. It's reciprocity. Let's restart our conversation across the board. Let's talk about these different issues, and let's look at, based on reciprocity, and then negotiate away from there. On this issue, you get this. On that issue, I get that. But go back to a reciprocity, because there's so much stuff that China can do overseas that foreign companies can't do in China now. That is a core issue, and I think that has to do with the research labs here and what you can do. But it would be a tragedy if the talent of China and the talent of America do not intermix, and venture capital in these nations does not intermix, because it's good for the world for all of that to happen, because there's just so many good things that can come out of that. But we are also stuck in kind of an global ideological battle now with Putin, Trump, and Xi. What is the ideology of the strongest ideology in the future now? I mean, democracy's not looking very good, and the Chinese and the Russians are having a good time being able to exploit that around the world. So I went way off topic there, but really I think it's what you can do in both countries. How do you work it out?
Just a comment on the reciprocity point. This really wasn't your intention, but in one sense that reinforces the Trump administration's view about the WTO and China, in that reciprocity is really directly incompatible with the whole idea of MFN, which is the cornerstone bedrock principle of the WTO. It is, in a sense, a recognition that there is something unique about China that requires a unique solution, and maybe that's true. In theory, it might be the right policy. It's difficult to see how that plays out in practice. What is it exactly? How we're going to match these two pieces? And I think the second potential complication of it is there are areas that we don't want China to be involved, right? Particularly in the high-tech space. I don't think we would accept a solution that said we're going to be reciprocal and we're both going to allow, complete open investment policy when it comes to technology. So, the terms of how you would set up a reciprocal arrangement, I think, are tricky. But it's an interesting idea, and maybe it is the way forward. You just need to think through how the parameters of that work.
Because whenever I say this, people get very nervous. But really, I'm not saying strict reciprocity. I'm saying change the conversation from that basis and negotiate away from there.
Right.
Because we still, the basis of U.S.-China right now is China was a poor country and America was a magnanimous country, and we were going to, be very open in how we did things. And now China's become powerful, and China adheres to the Western system when it works for China, and when it doesn't work, China has all these other mechanisms it's able to do because of its state system.
Right.
Z.
How do you guys propose to address the deep insecurity that exists on both sides? The insecurity on the U.S. side around the increasingly competitive China that will not go away even with the trade deal. And on the Chinese side, really, this deep insecurity, I think that's really confirmed by the ZTE case, that a state champion could be snuffed out by a simple political decision in America, which to many Chinese I've spoken to only meant that they needed to double down in their current strategy of achieving a level of independence in their own destiny. Right? There's these very deep human insecurities on both sides. And everything we've talked about are terrific, but they're tactics. And without addressing those deep insecurities, you're never going to get two trusting partners to address the core fundamental issues.
Maybe that's the way forward with the WTO, make it the World Therapy Organization, and see what we can do.
George,
I don't have a better answer.
over there.
Well, I mean, you're talking about political systems where the political culture of the systems is what it is. I think it's going to be up to American voters here to kind of sort things out, and in China, we'll see. One thing about what Trump has done in China, he's stirred things up among the elite there and where they want to be for their future.
Well, a couple
George
of
and
people,
Yabo, and then we got to move on. George.
couple of people brought up the contradictions that's going on between U.S. and China, and I kind of add a couple more. On the one hand, we all know that the state-owned enterprises in China do not operate very efficiently or effectively. I think the best example was a semiconductor project that they tried to grow in Shanghai that was directly ordered by the Fourth Ministry back in the 80s, right? And they bureaucrats know nothing about technology in the whole project. After billions of dollars, after NEC coming in as a partner, nothing came of it, basically. So on the one hand, state-owned enterprises involving in technology is not effective. As you have pointed out, leave it to the entrepreneurs. On the other hand, why are we, the politicians especially, why are we so fearful of what the state-owned enterprises is going to do in the world economy? It doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't fit together. And
We
since,
have a minute, so I'm just going to answer that question and then go on to this question because we've only got a minute left here. My answer on the SOEs is, yes, they're very inefficient, but when you're competing against an SOE that does not have to make money, and your company has to make money, if you've got an SOE that's a chip company and they get their hands on top memory chips, they'll flood the world with cheap memory chips and put Micron out of business. So that's the fear. They don't have, they don't have the same profit motive and the same limitations. Please.
Jim, I'm actually a bit surprised by your earlier comments. And by the way, I really enjoyed reading your book, 1 Billion Customers, which I read 2005, I suppose. I still one of my reference. I thought that you know China really well, right? And then you are in the consulting business. So I thought that your view would be more balanced, frankly. But you, at the beginning of your presentation, I was a little bit surprised by your statement saying that Making China 2025 is all about crushing, and use the word crushing, foreign companies. It's all about dominance. It's all about driving foreign companies out of China. And I read Making China 2025, which was a rather short document, frankly. And I read it again and again. I was born and raised in China, and I read a lot of Chinese documents. It's not so different from other policy inspirational statements from Chinese government. It's basically a document. Even the Center for Strategic and International Studies says that this is a document that wanted to upgrade Chinese manufacturing from so-called big manufacturing to strong manufacturing. And China has a lot of social and domestic problems: aging population, environmental degradation, and a lot of unemployment. So you don't have a lot of people taking care of the 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds in the future. So AI and and all that would be very important. So it's inspired by German Industry 4.0 as well. So I just wanted to challenge you on that, and want you perhaps to share with the audience, because a lot of us perhaps here have not read Making China 2025.
Well, also,
you can educate people on a few examples why you think Making China 2025 was meant to crush foreign companies.
Very simple. All of the subsectors have had to put out quotas on by what year they will have what market share in China.
I don't see that.
Well, it's published everywhere.
No, you need to read that. You show me that paragraph.
Give me your card. Look, I'm not anti-China at all. I'm very clear-eyed on what China is up to. Made in China 2025, a document like that is very smart on how do we, I wish the US would do it. What are the industries of the future we need? What are our problems? How do we solve them? But then it becomes all about China and not, and using foreign companies to get the technology and block them from the market. I mean, that's the problem with it. It's about blocking them from the market over time. And there's quotas, 70% by 25 in this industry, 60% in this industry, 100% in this industry. Where's the German guy? Talk to him. He's got it. He's got all the details.
Thank you, Jim and Jim. Let's hear it for him. Thank you.